And Joe will be talking about the verbalization of meaningless sounds interfering with hand grip initiation. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Jude. I'm just going to get right into it. I know we're running out of time. So athletes have a tendency to perform verbalizations. And sometimes these verbalizations are overt, like over here, where this athlete might be making a grunting sound right before swinging her racket. And sometimes the verbalizations are covert, like over here, where Serena Williams might be thinking about a phrase right before she moves, or perhaps she's reading a sign that one of her fans made for her right before she swings her racket. Now, we tend to study verbalizations in the context of sports psychology. What I mean by that is we're usually interested in knowing how they affect our motivation, our accuracy, our performance. However, one thing we tend to overlook is the close relationship between the speech system and the system that controls our hand movements. You might be thinking, well, it's true. Every time I talk, I have a tendency of moving my hands, and I'm doing it right now. And why is that? Well, it's because of how closely related the speech system is to the system that controls our hand movements. Now, so it makes sense to also study how verbalizations affect our hand movements. Now, Dr. Ramachandran made a really interesting observation. He said, not only do you move your hands when you speak, but we have a tendency to move our hands in a similar way as our mouth is moving during word production. For example, think about the word go. What happens to your lips? Well, you end up protruding them forward. But how do you gesture the word go? You end up extending your arm forward. How do you say the word come? Well, you press your lips together. How do you gesture the word come? You press your fingers on your palm. And so it's as though the movements of our hands are mimicking the movements of our mouth. You might be thinking, this is the English language, it's anecdotal, do we have evidence that this actually happens? And the answer is yes. There's a study that showed that when participants were shown a picture of a person with an open mouth, they could actually open their hand a lot faster than if they were shown a picture of someone with a closed mouth, which actually interfered with their ability to open their hand in a fast fashion. Now you look at this data and you're like, it makes sense, it's intuitive, but why is that? Well, because when you look on the left side over here, you can see that these two movements share an effect in common, and that effect is essentially the effect of openness. And so they feel compatible, whereas on the right side, one movement is producing a closed effect, the other movement's producing an open effect, they just feel incompatible. But why is it that the movements on the left are creating facilitation and the movements on the right are creating interference? Well, you can think about it from an ideomotor perspective. And the idea is when you're looking at an open mouth, for instance, you're seeing that effect of openness, you might also be simultaneously planning to open your mouth, but also open your hand because both of these effectors can produce that effect of openness. So we expect facilitation. Whereas on the other hand, if you're looking at a closed mouth, you might be planning to close your own hand, so if I subsequently ask you to open your hand, we should expect interference. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, so far we've been talking about compatibility between visual effects, but what about other sensory modalities, such as tactile sensation, and also different phonation structures? Because so far I've been talking about the mouth, but what about the tongue, which we use a lot during speech? And so this idea was tested by a group in Helsinki who said, okay, let's pick this syllable that contains the consonant t in it, and let's pair it up with a precision grip. And those two, in this case, we have two movements that are compatible. Why are they compatible? Because in both cases, the tactile sensation is happening at the tip of the effector. Okay, so that's the shared effect. And they said, okay, let's pick another syllable that has the consonant k in it, and let's pair that up with a power grip, because in both of these cases, the tactile sensation is typically happening at the back of the effector. You can try yourself, say t, k, and notice how the air pressure will shift in your mouth. So if we use an ideomotor perspective, we can also predict that if you plan to say t, then you should simultaneously be planning to say to make a precision grip. So there should be facilitation. Same idea applies here. If you plan to say k, you should simultaneously be planning to make a power grip. And you predict the reverse effect here. So if I'm planning to say t and then have to make a power grip, then that should create some kind of interference because they don't share the same effect. The same concept applies with k and precision grips. So this is what they did. They had a verbalization condition, and then you sat in front of a computer screen and you were shown different syllables. Sometimes it was a syllable T in black, and sometimes it was ka in black. And what the black font essentially meant was that you had to silently read it in your head, but you also had to get ready to say it out loud, okay? So when the syllable, or the color of the syllable changed, so to blue, you had to do two things at once. You had to overtly verbalize it, so you say ka out loud, but in this case, you also had to make a precision grip. So how do you make a precision grip? If you look at the bottom right, you depressed a microswitch with your index and your thumb. Now, if it turned green, you had to say "ka" out loud, but this time you made a power grip. And the way that you made a power grip is you would basically use your 3 remaining fingers to depress a separate microswitch. So this is what they found. On the x-axis, you're looking at the syllables that they verbalized, as well as the grips that they initiated. And on the y-axis, you're looking at the mean reaction time of the grips. You could clearly see that precision grip reaction time was significantly shorter when the syllable T was verbalized versus ka, and power grip reaction time was significantly shorter when the syllable ka was verbalized in comparison to T. So the authors said, yay, evidence for facilitation, and they got really excited. And then I said, well, wait a minute, we can't really speak to facilitation just yet without a grip alone condition, right? So a condition where you're only performing precision and power grips without the presentation of syllables. And so I replicated their study, and in addition to the verbalization condition, I added a grip alone condition, and here, instead of showing syllables in black, I showed squares that were shown in black that would eventually change colors, so either green or blue, and then you would make a corresponding hand grip. And then I also gave participants 600 milliseconds to initiate their hand grip. Now, I also added a silent reading condition. So in this case, when the syllable turned or changed colors, you simply made a grip response, but when it was in black, you only read it in your head. And the reason I chose to add a silent reading condition is because the experiment that I presented earlier, it's actually quite unclear if the effect was due to the silent reading that happened before the grip initiation, or if it was due to the overt verbalization of the syllable. And so my main dependent variable was mean delta reaction time, and so what I did is I basically took the grip by syllable conditions, I subtracted them from the grip alone condition to see whether facilitation or interference happened or was present. And then I did a 1-sample t-test on every single condition to essentially see whether the differences were significantly different from 0. So the idea is if the syllables do not interfere or facilitate with your hand grips, then we would expect that the delta mean reaction time is not different than 0. Whereas if we predict facilitation, we would also expect that the mean delta reaction time would be significantly smaller than 0, and interference would essentially mean that the delta reaction time should be greater than 0. And we expect that the facilitation happened with compatible syllables and interference happened with incompatible syllables. So this is what we found. On the y-axis, you're looking at the mean delta reaction time. X-axis are the grips that they initiated. And in gray is when they said T, and in ka is when they said or read ka. Sorry, in black is ka, and then T is in gray. So you can clearly see that power grip reaction time was significantly interfered with when you read or said T, whereas power grip was not facilitated or interfered by the syllable ka. And then you can clearly see that the syllable ka interfered with the initiation of a precision grip, while the syllable T did not facilitate or interfere with the initiation of a precision grip. And so this is actually data collapse between verbalization and silent reading conditions because there was no differences between the two, which essentially means that it was the silent reading, the covert verbalization of the syllables that led to this effect. So one of the issues that was addressed was, the idea that I only gave participants 600 milliseconds to make a grip response. And so they said, well, what if the interference effect that you saw had nothing to do with the incompatibility between the syllable and the grip? Maybe it's some kind of bottleneck that I created by having you read and then detect a color and then make a grip response. Maybe there's so much happening and that's why we're seeking interference. And so I did a follow-up study where this time I gave them 1,500 milliseconds to make a grip response. And as you can see, I only used the grip alone and the silent reading condition because obviously the effect was mainly present in the silent reading condition. And so I also added catch trials, and catch trials essentially just means that the square remains black, the syllable remains black, and if that happens, then you don't make a grip response. And I just wanted to avoid or prevent anticipation. So this is just a reference, so you can remember the results of experiment 1. But the results from a second experiment basically showed that when I gave participants more time to respond, there was even more interference, right? So I can't actually say that what was happening here, or the interference effect that was observed in experiment 1 was due to this bottleneck or because I made people rush to respond, because it clearly gets worse in, when you give them more time, and the compatible syllables now are beginning to interfere with grip response. really sure why this is the case. We are thinking about follow-up studies to investigate this, but one of the ideas that we're thinking about is it might be due to some kind of decay in your planning activation, right? So if you're planning to different movements and you take forever to initiate one, how long are you going to keep that movement in like how long are you going to plan it for? Maybe you start to kind of decrease that activation, and if you have to subsequently increase it again, that might be perhaps costing you. Okay, so this leads me to my discussion. Really the take-home message here is the silent reading of incompatible syllables will interfere with grip initiation. The silent reading of a compatible syllable is neither going to facilitate or interfere with the initiation of a hand grip so long as your reaction times are relatively fast. And the silent reading of any syllable will interfere with hand grip initiation when your reaction times are a lot longer. Okay, so some considerations here. In the sport industry, how many times, like how many words do we see around us? They're all over us. They're on advertisements, they're on our jerseys, they're on the signs that we carry to support our athletes. But the thing is, what I'm trying to show is that that might be a little bit of an issue because words are not as innocuous as we think they are because they clearly have access to our motor system. And so in the same way that we usually try to kind of discourage spectators from making noise during a golf tournament, I don't think it would be a bad idea to discourage having too many words around our athletes as we do not want to interfere with their performance. On that, I'd like to thank our funding agencies, my supervisor for always supporting my crazy ideas, and Stephanie, I don't know where you are, but thank you so much for collecting the data. I would not be here if it wasn't for you. Thank you.